Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining our webcast today. I'm really excited to share one of the more innovative areas of research at NREL on social burden today. My name is Kate Anderson, and I'm the strategy lead at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. NREL is one of 17 Department of Energy national labs, where our vision is a clean energy future for the world. I'm excited to have here today with us Bobby Jeffers and Roderick Jackson. Bobby, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Kate. Yeah, I am a senior advisor at NREL on resilience R&D, and I sit in our Energy Security and Resilience Center here.
Perfect. And Roderick?
Thanks, Kate. Yes, my name is Roderick Jackson, and I'm the lab program manager for our building technologies research here at NREL.
Awesome. Great to have you both here today. So today we're talking about social burden. So society experiences cascading consequences during power outages, especially during long duration outages that largely coincide with disasters. These can include everything from economic losses as simple as spoiled food or something like lost wages from inability to work. It also includes national security consequences, such as disruptions to Department of Defense missions. And then there are also social costs. So this can include dangerous temperatures that can lead to health risks and sometimes even death. NREL is supporting the Department of Energy and others in researching and demonstrating and deploying resilient solutions for these problems. And for more than 15 years, NREL has worked with communities and organizations looking to enhance their resilience. So this work has informed our scalable methodologies for resilience planning and valuation. And today we look forward to talking with two of our experts that are really at the intersection of resilience and equity about NREL's research on social burden and how this is being used to inform energy system planning. So I'd like to start, Roderick, with your perspective. Can you tell us about the role of buildings in major outages?
Yes, thanks. So if you think about it, when you have a major outage, as you explained with weather and such, the place where people go is in their buildings. They're either at work or they're at school or they're at home. And so buildings really play a very critical, if not central, role in the outage. And so as we think about that role that they play, it's really essential to look at, well, what happens in that case. And I think that's where some of the opportunities here and say, okay, well, when you have a heat wave like we're seeing in dramatic cases this year and others, I think each year we see getting more of those, the impact of the people inside of buildings are felt. And so the question is, if the building infrastructure has the building infrastructure varies throughout different communities, I think the impact or the role or even the consequences of such starts to vary as well.
But tell me a little bit more about that. How might we see uneven distribution of societal consequences in a major outage?
And so when you think about the building infrastructure, we have over 120 some odd million buildings in the US, with a large number of those buildings being built with different layers of building codes and different layers or different upgrades to the building. And so what happens is the built infrastructure, actually the building envelope, as we like to think about it, that's everything that envelops the actual building itself. So that's the walls, the roof, the attic and the floors. And so that really keeps the outside out and the inside in. And when you have an outage, that's really a core aspect of kind of ensuring or ensuring that the negative consequences are not dramatically felt. And so you think about that, the fact that you have a quite a large distribution per se of the state of the building envelope. Some building envelopes are tight, and that means they're very good at keeping the outside out, the inside in. Some are very leaky. I think we've all been in those buildings where when as soon as gets cold outside, we immediately have that feeling inside. Or as it gets hot outside, we immediately feel that inside of the window that's not able to adequately keep the cold out and the warm in. And so these are the aspects that we see. And so when you have these large disparities in the building envelope, and you have these outages or you have these extreme events, you start to see the impact on the occupants, particularly as the building is in worse shape. The impact to the occupant is even greater. And when you have an outage, now you have the case where, okay, where the building was at a certain level, the ability of that building to maintain its passive survivability is one of the terms that's used, but its ability to maintain a comfortable or a satisfying condition starts to degrade more rapidly depending on the initial building and particularly the building envelope. And so that's where we start to see, if you're in a poor, uninsulated, leaky building, your impact of an outage is felt quicker or faster than it would be if you were in a very well building, say a passive house building. And so now we start to see the impact of the outages felt through just the existing state of the built infrastructure, being that those in those communities start to see more and faster impacts and consequences.
Okay. So the nuance you're talking about here is that for certain people, an outage of even like a day or even a few hours can be life-threatening. And so there's really that disproportionate social burden on populations that are already disadvantaged. And so when we start to translate that to NREL into our research, system-wide planning that accounts for those social burdens is the way to level the playing field.
I think there are multiple ways. I think, yes, this is a great question. I think there are a few ways to level the playing field. I think one is to first understand the situation. I think if we only look at the problem from a top-down level and we actually don't see those differences that I just articulated, being the difference in consequences of these outages, and sometimes you don't see the differences that actually occur, we're not able to address it, right? So if you don't first see and understand the challenge, you're not able to address it. Once you can actually bring the analysis or the understanding to a level to see the disparities in the built envelope per se, or even in the infrastructure, both the equipment and the envelope combined, you can start to see, well, we need to take different approaches or different measures to be able to adequately address this, to be able to level the playing field. And one of those could be at your system planning level. So your system planning level has to be at a level to understand the actual individual impacts. And I think that's where the tension sometimes occurs, is that in your system planning, how detailed do you get, how resolute do you get? And the more resolute you get, the more you're able to see the disparities that occur. You're able to see the difference in building envelopes, or the even difference in the actual grid, because a lot of times the investment in the buildings is the investment in the grid is aligned with the investment in the infrastructure, and so the two are not distinct often. And so once you see the correlation or the combination of a local grid that the infrastructure hasn't been upgraded, in addition to the built environment hasn't been updated, you start to see the effect of outages actually occurring more frequently and the impact being more severe. So the combination of the two requires us to take a system level planning that allows us to see that distinction, so that we plan appropriately for different situations.
Okay. So maybe digging into that a little bit more, what would you say in your experience has limited grid and building designers and planners in really creating a system that provides these services to those most in need?
I think it's that resolution. I think there's a tension that often occurs, is how granular to go. I think that's the question we would all like to be, we would all like to design at a system level. Well, the challenge is you don't have the computational tractability, or even the ability to make decisions if you are understanding every detail to the toaster level per se, right? To understand when the toaster is going to provide or to be on. And so the question is, how resolute do you need to be in your data or your analysis or your planning effects to be able to understand how best to approach this question of how to design or enhance resilience from both a combined buildings as well as grid approach. So I think one of the biggest challenges is having the appropriate level of granularity in our system planning to be able to ascertain the differences that occur between different communities. And then being able to do it at a level that allows us to see that, but also allows us to plan going back. There's been studies that show you can enhance the ability to passively survive after an outage by 40 to 50% in different communities by doing different envelope improvements. And so if your grid planning is not able to see, well, we could, by taking certain building measures, actually enhance or decrease the need to provide other measures at the system level. If we don't have that ability to see that difference, we may make decisions that look good on the system level, but the distinctions between communities break down. So I think, to answer your question, it's really all about having the appropriate level of granularity to see the distinctions, and also having the appropriate level of decision making to be able to include improvements in the building envelope per se, or in the equipment, particularly in the building envelope, so that you can realize it at the system level.
That makes a lot of sense. Bobby, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I really think that at the end of the day, you can't improve what you don't measure, right? And one of the things that we've been hearing from state energy offices, electric utilities, public utility commissions, those sorts of folks that really are planning out the grid, right, is that they're looking for metrics and approaches that help them understand how to go beyond reliability of the system into resilience, and how to blend that with increasing focus on individuals and on providing a fair and accurate benefit to a wide number of individuals within their jurisdictions. And so, that sort of blends their approaches, some of their newer regulations around equity and focusing on improving equity in those jurisdictions, with a very historic lack of planning for resilience. And there's a lot of reasons that we don't have standardized resilience planning approaches in this country. One of the reasons that we're working on at the labs is that it's hard. And so it is very difficult to take very low amounts of data, right, on historic outage situations and what people needed during those situations, where people were during those situations, and how something like the grid and the buildings together could have provided a better response to those situations. It's very difficult to do that because every historic major event looks different. Katrina looks different than Hurricane Maria, looks different than Superstorm Sandy, looks different than the wildfires that we saw in California a couple of years ago. And so the research here really is starting to support some more decision making around, with very little data environment, how do we still say something real about how what we change on the grid, what we change in buildings actually ends up affecting people during these critical events.
So I'd like to come back to the metric that you've developed around social burden and talk a little bit about that and maybe some of the possible applications of social burden analysis. So Radek, where do you see opportunities for this in buildings research?
I think they're great opportunities. I think going back to kind of the equity question and to the metrics, I think one of the things that's kind of critical is there's a few things. I think one, it has to be technically and scientifically credible, and I think that's where the team can really be able to. And I think that's a kind of the role of a national lab and a team of partners to be able to dig in and make sure that we have the right scientific foundation or technical foundation. So just the foundation there. But then second is, and I think that's where going back to the kind of the equity perspective is, how do we ensure that what we are developing that is technically credible for all applications, or for applications across all populations? Because a lot of times, unfortunately, our technical credibility is applicable in one aspect, or maybe one community, one built environmental community plus the grid. But then the edge case, or different cases where you have maybe a built infrastructure that is in where we have, to Bobby's point, where the data environment, or we don't have as data rich a repository of data to pull from to be able to establish our metrics. How do we then apply our metrics in those cases? So I think that's where the question is, in order for that metric to be really and to be broadly applied, we have to make sure that even when we don't have a richness of data, a rich data repository to be able to develop the metrics, that we still identify ways to make sure that it is appropriate. So first, it has to be scientifically credible for all building types, and then for all building types. And then lastly, it just has to make sure it's comprehensive, so that it includes the ability to understand from a efficiency standpoint, so we can see the operational aspect, but now we're including these additional metrics for how do we also not just operation, but also resilience. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, particularly in the building space.
Yeah. And Bobby, what about in the community space? Can you tell us a little bit about how you're using this in some of our technical assistance to communities?
Sure. Yeah, there's a number of programs currently funded across different pieces of the Department of Energy. And one of those areas that I'd really like to hone into is a project that was just recently funded as part of a set of projects funded by the Solar Energy Technology Office in EERE, which is under the Department of Energy. And so this set of projects is called RACER, and we have one of those projects that we're leading with a number of partners. We're working with Seattle City Light, which is a municipal utility that serves the city of Seattle, with University of Washington there, some students there that can be on the ground with some communities. We're working with a couple of local communities there served by Seattle City Light. We're working with the University at Buffalo. And finally, we're bringing in additional grid expertise from EPRI. And so with this project, we're calling it SCORE, which stands for Solar at the Convergence of Resilience and Equity. And we're bringing in social burden, and we're asking questions like, does social burden actually reflect you, community, what you think about in terms of resilience for your community? What pieces of social burden do you really resonate more with? And then how would you define what's most critical during different scenarios in your community? And we can bring that into the parameterization of the metric and then bring that into the way that Seattle City Light does power system planning. And we can take a look at things like, hey, the community has identified a community center that they would like to use during a black sky type of event, during a major power outage. And they've identified that they can get food, water, maybe some sheltering and some charging of their cell phones, right, for communications out of that facility. We've also identified a number of other services that the community can't get with that particular investment. And so we might look at additional ways to provide those services, maybe working with the emergency planners in that community to make sure that we have an all of the above service approach. And so that social burden will not be lacking in any one category. So we're kind of combining that qualitative social science based research with the quantitative grid design and that type of research and planning to be able to, I think, finally, again, say something real about if we move forward with this type of grid, here's how it's actually going to affect people on the ground during the next outage.
That's really interesting to hear. And I find that quantitative integration can be really hard sometimes and also super, super important to actually addressing the challenges we need to address. So with that, I'm curious, when you think about the role of industry and the role of the federal government, the role of state and local governments, why do you think that measuring social burden is really a challenge that the National Lab should be addressing?
Yeah, so again, it's because it's a fundamentally hard problem. So we're talking about once in a lifetime events that often change the course of people's lives and their children's lives. We're targeting something that is currently what we would call a public good, which is the provision of basic human needs during a disaster type of scenario. That fundamentally we think of government as being structured to support, and a lot of our research supports the federal government. Specifically, we work in partnership with state and local governments as well. The second piece of that, beyond just being a public good, is that there's a really low volume of data on historic events here. And so it takes some really interesting and mathematically hard approaches to work in that data poor environment, right? You know, our existing data sets themselves can be inequitable because we've got gaps in representation of disadvantaged communities. So how can we build sort of a system that is able to fill in the right data gaps where they exist, and then create a ground truth around this is what has happened in previous outages across the country in different communities, and then move forward with ability to forecast that. That's a fundamentally what we call a national lab hard problem, because it takes 5 or 6 or 7 different technical pieces of expertise all working together. And again, you mentioned the social science and some of that more qualitative research. It takes that as well. So we do some of that here at NREL. We also work with academia in many cases on that. So it really does take a community of effort across very many different technology readiness levels for us to be able to tackle that.
Sounds like a perfect problem for a national lab. I'm curious how the social burden metric came about. Can you take us back to when it was first developed?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Kate. So really, this goes back to some work that we were leading when I was at Sandia National Laboratories. And we had really focused on working with emergency managers in a response and recovery sort of mode after major disruptions. We did a lot of work in places like New Orleans, a lot of work in Norfolk, Virginia, a lot of work in New York City, really following some of those past major disruptions and power outages. And we learned from that emergency management, emergency response community that they were really focused on providing services to people, that they saw that as their major job during a disruption. And that if they had a mechanism to quantify that, I think it would look a lot like social burden, but we didn't have that at the time. And so we did some work, especially funded by the Grid Modernization Lab Consortium, GMLC, at Department of Energy in New Orleans, trying to work together with the community, the utility, the emergency planners, and really trying to figure out what would be an approach that would take this up to the grid. And then Hurricanes Maria and Irma hit Puerto Rico. And there was a massive response to try to think about how would we rebuild this system in a way that is better than the system before, and in a way that focuses on providing those services to people during the next hurricane or the next major outage there in Puerto Rico. And so that's when we said, okay, we've got this general approach, but we don't have a metric yet. And so we just drew some math on the board, and it took, a few weeks to really get around that. But what I love about this is now that we have this metric, and we created it while I was at Sandia. Now we have two labs working on this. We've got Sandia and NREL really working together on integrating that metric, validating that metric, and bringing it to new spaces like the building space that Roderick mentioned.
Do you foresee a day when utilities are using more universal social burden standards alongside their current standards, like reliability?
I do. I think we're starting to see some of this already. We talk with a number of public utility commissions. We talk with a number of state energy offices, and a number of utilities. We work with a number of community-based organizations and directly with communities on this, and we're hearing a real need and interest for quantitative approaches that reflect the social impacts of a more resilient system. We also see a lot of opportunity out there with things like IIJA, the recent bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed about a year and a half ago, and opportunities in a number of federal investments that are recent, that are investing in resilience and are asking for applicants or asking for awardees to report how they made communities better with that work. And resilience is one of those dimensions in a lot of those awards that's really targeted. So being able to start to report that, yes, we have made an impact, a real impact on social resilience through an infrastructure investment, it's something that we're seeing more and more from our federal government and those types of opportunities, more and more from state regulators. And so we need to rise to the challenge to be able to confidently quantify that, or else really we're just sort of waving our hands, right?
Yeah. All right, I would like to close with one last question about what you both think is the path forward for energy system planning with social burden and how people can learn more. So Bobby, what do you think?
So that ground truth that I mentioned is what's really hard, and we can't do it alone. I think we need to catalyze this, catalyze more research with more partners so that we can really validate this. I'm still waiting for that seminal paper or that seminal body of research that when we start to go to a community-based organization, a utility, a public utility commission, or a state energy office, all of them can agree, yes, this is ready. Yes, we have confidence that something like social burden is what we want to use to reflect social resilience and to project the impact of a particular investment, whether it's in a building or on the grid, on that social resilience. And so to do that, we need to work with more community-based organizations, more of industry, more utilities, more governments, right? And critically, we need to bring in academia where the national labs just don't have or should not have certain capabilities. So it's going to take, I think, a bigger village working together on this, but I think we're on a good track.
Yeah, I'd agree. What about you, Roderick? What are your thoughts on the path forward?
I think the path forward, really focusing on putting people first, right? And I think if you look at that people focused or that people centric approach says, one, let's make sure we're prioritizing the future of mankind through decarbonization, making sure that we're eye on the ball of continuing down the path of decarbonizing our energy future, but really also making sure that we're understanding the present realities of we're seeing these once in a lifetime events more often, so that we need to make sure that we're enabling people to be able to survive through these events. And so that's where some equitable solutions that are resilient are required. So this ability to put people focused, to be people centric, while prioritizing both the future and the present, I think that's really the path forward. And so to Bobby's point, it's a hard problem, but it's a necessary solution that we have to provide.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we will close there. I'd like to thank you both, Bobby and Roderick, for being with us today. We really appreciate all of your insights. For listeners, please visit the Energy Security and Resilience website for more information on our research. And we welcome you to reach out to Bobby Jeffers for more information on this. Thank you all. Bye.